I think the most terrifying thing in the world isn't a sudden, violent shock, but the slow, sinking realization that the ground beneath your feet is a lie. I used to believe the ghosts of Detroit were just that, ghosts. Echoes in vinyl-sided houses with boarded-up windows, the phantoms of a million forgotten workers. I thought the dangers were tangible, human, the furtive, desperate eyes in a squat, the treacherous groan of rotting floorboards about to give way, the leaden silence of a place that had been left to bleed out. I was a fool. The real horror wasn't the decay. It was the thing that had refused to die, the thing that had been growing, perfectly preserved, in the belly of the rot. We went in at dusk, the four of us, because the dying light made. The Packard plant looked like the skeleton of a forgotten god. The sky was a bruised purple, streaked with the last fiery gasps of the sun, and the cold October air carried the scent of wet brick, rust, and distant wood smoke. The plant itself was a sprawling, Gothic nightmare of crumbling concrete and jagged rebar, a graveyard of American ambition stretching for blocks. Stalkers, we called ourselves, with the arrogant romance of youth, as if we were exploring some ancient, mythical ruin and not just trespassing in a monument to failure. There was Leo, our fearless leader, all manic energy and a chattering camcorder he used to document our missions. Maya, the skeptic, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her practicality a grounding wire for Leo's exuberance. Chad, the muscle, who thought a cocky grin and a six-pack made him invincible. And then there was me, Eli, the chronicler, the one who always felt the weight of these places, the silent stories screaming from the peeling paint. This way, Leo whispered, his voice a hollow echo in the vast, eviscerated space of what was once the main assembly floor. His camera's light was a frail spear in the overwhelming gloom, catching the spectral dance of dust motes. I read online there's a sub-level the Urbex guys haven't fully mapped, something about the concrete being too thick to get through. His words were swallowed by the cavernous dark. Above us, the skeletal remains of roof trusses clawed at a sky now littered with the first sharp, cold stars. Our footsteps crunched a symphony of broken glass, dead leaves, and the gritty powder of pulverized concrete. We picked our way through a forest of dead machinery, their shapes grotesque and alien in the half-light. Massive presses stood frozen mid-stroke, their purpose lost to time, their steel skins blistered with orange cancer. Chains hung from the ceiling like sinister vines, and the shadows they cast seemed to twitch and writhe at the edge of vision. The air grew thicker, colder, as we moved deeper, the smell of decay giving way to something else, a dry, metallic tang, like old blood and ozone. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat. It was Maya who found it, of course, while Leo was panning his camera dramatically across a wall of faded, ghostly graffiti. She was running her hands over a section of the far wall that looked different. It wasn't crumbling concrete, but a seamless, grime-caked steel plate, almost invisible in the darkness, set into the foundation. "This isn't right," she murmured, her voice tight. "This steel, it's too new. There's no rust through." She wiped away a patch of grime with her sleeve, revealing a surface that was smooth, cold, and unnervingly intact. It was a door, and at its center was a keypad, its plastic cover smashed, the wires within exposed like glistening, metallic nerves. Leo was on it in a heartbeat, his camcorder now a spotlight. "No way," he breathed, a grin splitting his face. "This is it. This is the jackpot." Chad, ever the brute, gave the door a shove, but it didn't budge. It was Leo, the tinkerer, who saw the solution in the exposed wiring. With a pocket multi-tool and a recklessness that still haunts my dreams, he crossed to frayed wires. A spark leapt, sharp and blue. And with a deep, resonant thud that I felt in my teeth more than heard, the door slid open, smooth and silent, revealing a darkness so absolute it looked solid. And from that darkness, it rose, a sound. Not the wind whistling through broken panes, or the skittering of rats. This was a low, pervasive hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. It was pitched so low it was almost a feeling rather than a noise of pressure in the inner ear, a subsonic thrum that set my fillings aching and stirred a primal fear in the base of my skull. It was the sound of power, of something alive, of industry. It was the sound of a heart still beating in a corpse. Leo whooped, a sound that was obscenely loud in the tomb-like silence. "Told you, I fucking told you." He was already stepping into the dark, his camera light bobbing ahead of him like a will-o'-the-wisp. Chad followed with a grunt of affirmation. Maya hesitated, her hand on my arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "Eli," she whispered, "that sound. That's not right." But the pull of the unknown, the siren's song of the secret, was too strong. I gave her what I hoped was a reassuring nod, my own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and followed the light into the humming dark. The heavy steel door sliding shut behind us with a final, deafening click that sealed our fate. The door sealed with a sound that was less a noise and more an ending. The world of decay and dusk we had left behind, the crunch of glass, the whisper of wind through broken windows, was severed in an instant, replaced by a sterile, pressurized silence broken only by that pervasive, gut-deep hum. Leo's camera light, which had seemed so brave and bright moments before, was now a pathetic, guttering flame in an ocean of ink. It carved a trembling path through the darkness, revealing only a few feet of a concrete floor, unnervingly clean and free of the debris that littered the world above. The air was different here. It was cold, dry, and carried a scent that was achingly familiar yet horribly out of place, the smell of machine oil, ozone, and something faintly chemical, like antiseptic. "Whoa," Chad breathed, his voice hushed not out of caution, but genuine awe. "This is some secret government shit." His bravado had melted into a kind of reverent confusion. We were in a corridor, wide and low-ceilinged, its walls and floor made of the same seamless, industrial-grade concrete. Conduit pipes and thick bundles of cable, all pristine and modern, ran along the ceiling in neat, parallel lines. There were no graffiti tags, no dust, no signs of the slow, organic death that claimed everything else in the plant. This place was maintained. This place was used. "The power's still on," Maya whispered, her voice tight. She was pointing a trembling finger at a small, green LED light on a junction box affixed to the wall. It glowed with a steady, malevolent patience. "This isn't just a backup generator, Eli. This is a grid. A dedicated one." Her pragmatism was fraying at the edges, the reality of the situation sandblasting away her skepticism. We were insects that had crawled into the sealed, functioning guts of a massive and indifferent machine. Leo, however, was in his element. The hum, the clean lines, the hidden technology, it was a narcotic to his curiosity. "This is better than I ever imagined," he muttered, his camcorder panning slowly across the sterile walls. "They said the lower levels were flooded. They said it was just more collapse. This is a whole other world." He started forward, his footsteps echoing with a hollow, metallic quality on the gridded floor. We followed, a chain of nervous ducklings, drawn by his light and our own morbid fascination. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, a straight line into the earth's belly. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the corridor ended not in a wall, but in a vast, open space. Leo's light beam faltered, unable to find a far wall or a ceiling. It was like we had stepped out of a tunnel and into a cavern, but one that was man-made, colossal. The air here was different again. The hum was louder, a physical pressure that made my ears pop and my teeth ache. It was punctuated now by other, more distinct mechanical sounds: the distant, rhythmic pneumatic hiss of a piston, the low whir of a motor, the faint, metallic clink that repeated at precise, unnerving intervals. "Give me some light, Chad," Leo ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Chad fumbled in his pack and produced a heavy-duty LED flashlight. He clicked it on, and the beam, far stronger than the cameras, cut a swath through the darkness. It was like a religious revelation, a scene from some cybernetic hell. We were on a metal gantry, high above a factory floor. And below us, stretching into the impenetrable dark, was a conveyor line. It was a long, serpentine track of polished steel and pristine rollers, illuminated by rows of cold, blue-white lead strips suspended from the impossibly high ceiling. The light gleamed off the flawless surfaces, creating a landscape of sharp highlights and deep, absolute shadows. The line was moving, not with the jarring, clanking chaos of an old assembly line, but with a smooth, silent, terrifying efficiency. And it was building something. From our vantage point, we couldn't make out the details of the components being carried along the belt. They were pale, complex shapes, held in intricate fixtures, robotic arms. Their movements, a fluid and silent ballet of hydraulics and servos, would descend from the gloom above. They weren't the hulking, clumsy robots of automotive lore. These were multi-jointed, spider-like appendages, ending in tools that whirred and spun with blinding speed. One arm applied a bead of gleaming, silver solder to a joint. Another made precise, incisive cuts with a laser that left the air smelling of burnt calcium. We stood there, frozen, for what felt like an hour, just watching this silent, automated ballet. The sheer scale of it, the immense hidden industry, was mind-breaking. This wasn't a relic, it was a thriving, secret organ buried in the city's corpse. My eyes, straining in the stark light, began to pick out details on the pale components moving along the line. They weren't metal or plastic. The texture was wrong, porous, striated in places, too organic. They were the color of old ivory, of bone, and one of them, as it passed directly below us, was unmistakably, horrifyingly, a human femur, fused at one end to a complex lattice of shimmering, metallic alloy. A strangled, guttural sound escaped my throat, a noise I didn't recognize as my own. It was the sound of fundamental truths breaking. The world did not make sense anymore. The pristine efficiency, the cold blue light, the humming silence, it was all a beautiful, terrible veneer over something unspeakable. My mind recoiled, trying to reject the image seared onto my retina. That long, unmistakable human bone, seamlessly integrated with the machined latticework of metal as if they had grown together. This wasn't a factory, it was a charnel house dressed in the sterile garments of industry. "What the hell is that?" Chad whispered, his voice cracking. The bravado was utterly gone, replaced by a childlike fear. He leaned further over the railing, his flashlight beam trembling as it tracked the femur's progress down the line. Are those bones? Don't. Maya snapped, her hand clamping onto his arm, her knuckles white. Her face was a mask of horrified comprehension. Don't draw attention. It was a ridiculous thing to say to a whispering, trembling light in a vast, automated space, but the instinct was primal. We were observers in a sacred, profane space, and to be noticed was to be profane ourselves. Leo, however, was a statue. He hadn't moved a muscle, his camcorder held steady, the little red recording light a cyclops eye staring unblinkingly at the nightmare below. The horror of its mechanism was a tiny, insignificant protest against the monumental hum. "They're assemblers," he breathed, his voice full of a twisted wonder. "But the feedstock? It's not sheet metal. It's biological. Fused with synthetics." He was trying to process it through the lens of engineering, the only framework he had, and it was buckling under the strain. We watched, paralyzed, as the silent ballet continued. Another robotic arm, this one ending in a complex array of needles and syringes filled with a viscous, pearlescent fluid, descended. It injected the fluid into porous-looking joints on a different component, a complex structure that looked like a spinal column reforged with titanium vertebrae. The fluid was absorbed instantly, and the pale bone seemed to shimmer for a moment, as if energizing. Further down the line, a laser etcher, its beam a precise, violet thread, carved minute, circuit-like patterns onto a flat section of what I could now clearly see was a fused rib cage. This was not mere assembly. This was refinement. This was creation. The scale of it was the true horror. The conveyor line stretched into the darkness, a river of these blasphemous amalgamations. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, in various stages of completion. They weren't all humanoid. Some were smaller, more complex, like the internal workings of a clock made from sinew and silver. Others were larger, bulkier, with terrifying, piston-like appendages that suggested a brutal, inhuman purpose. This was an ecosystem of abomination, a taxonomy of things that should not be. "We have to go," Maya said, her voice a thin, desperate wire. She was pulling at my jacket sleeve. "Eli, we have to get out of here. Now." Her fear was infectious, a cold spike finally piercing the numb disbelief that had encased me. This was no longer an adventure, it was a trespass of the highest order. We were seeing something we were never meant to see, the secret work of a god with no face and a morality written in cold code. It was Chad who broke the spell of horrified observation. He stumbled back from the railing, his boot catching on a loose bolt that had somehow found its way onto the otherwise immaculate gantry. The sound was a gunshot in the cavernous space, a loud, metallic clang that rolled out across the factory floor, echoing off the distant, unseen walls. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The rhythmic hiss of the nearest piston stopped dead. The low whir of the motor driving the conveyor belt seized into silence. The precise, metronomic clink of components settling into place ceased. The only sound that remained was the deep, foundational hum, which seemed to deepen, to thicken with a new, ominous intent. Below us, the entire, miles-long production line ground to a perfect, simultaneous halt. Every single robotic arm froze in place, their tools hovering inches from their work, their silent ballet interrupted. The great machine had been startled. And in the sudden, profound silence that followed the echo of Chad's mistake, we could feel its attention, vast and mechanical, slowly turning toward us. The silence was a physical weight, crushing and absolute. It was the silence of a held breath, a predator frozen mid-pounce. For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. The great biomechanical garden below us was petrified, a hellish exhibit in a museum of the damned. The only evidence that time hadn't stopped was the relentless, deepening hum that now vibrated up through the metal gritting of the gantry, into the solace of my boots, and into the marrow of my bones. It was a sound of awakening consciousness, a low-frequency query searching for the source of the interruption. Then, the lights changed. It didn't happen all at once. It began at the far end of the line, a wave of crimson that swept towards us with methodical, terrifying speed. The cold, sterile blue-white LEDs flickered once, twice, and then drowned in a bloody, emergency red. The wave hit our section, and the world was washed in the color of raw meat and exposed viscera. The shadows, once sharp and black, now writhed like living things, pooling in the sockets of unfinished skulls and the joints of frozen robotic arms. The pristine factory floor was transformed into a scene from a cosmic abattoir. "Run," Leo whispered, the word a dry crackle of air. It was the first sound any of us had made since the clang, and it broke the paralysis. "Now, go," we didn't need telling twice. We turned as one, a frantic scramble of limbs, and bolted back the way we had come, toward the corridor that was our only known exit. Our footsteps were thunderous in the new, red silence, a frantic, panicked drumbeat against the metal. The hum seemed to pulse in time with our flight, a monstrous heart now beating in the walls, the floor, the very air. We hadn't taken 10 steps when a new sound joined the symphony of dread, a high-pitched, hydraulic whine from directly below us. I risked a glance over my shoulder, my heart seizing in my chest. The robotic arms were moving again, but they were no longer attending to their work on the conveyor line. In a series of jerky, precise motions, they were retracting, reorienting, their multi-jointed limbs folding and unfolding to point their various tools, the welders, the lasers, the injectors, upward, toward the gantry. Toward us. They were no longer assemblers. They were sentinels. They were weapons. A searing white line of light lanced past my head, so close I felt the heat of it singe my hair. The smell of ozone and burned air was instantaneous. A laser had fired from one of the arms, striking the concrete wall ahead of us with a sharp crack, leaving a smoldering, blackened scar, a warning shot, or a missed shot. "Faster," Chad screamed, his voice raw with terror. He was in the lead, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating the blessed dark rectangle of the corridor entrance maybe 50 yards ahead. It felt like a mile. Maya was just behind him, then me, with Leo bringing up the rear, his camcorder still somehow clutched in his hand, its red light a mocking echo of the hellish glow that now filled the cavern. Another laser shot, this one hitting the gantry railing to my left. The metal glowed cherry red for a second before cooling. They were finding their range. We were targets in a shooting gallery, and the gallery itself was alive and hostile. The hum was now a roar, a subsonic scream of pure, mechanized fury. I could feel it in my teeth, in the fillings, a drilling vibration that promised annihilation. Leo cried out a short, sharp yelp of pain and surprise. I glanced back again and saw him stumble, his camcorder clattering to the floor. One of the injector arms had fired a jet of that pearlescent chemical, and it had caught him in the shoulder, soaking through his jacket. He didn't stop, clutching his arm and surging forward, but his face was a grimace of agony and something else, a horrified understanding. The fluid wasn't just corrosive, it felt wrong, a violation on a cellular level. We reached the corridor. Chad practically dove into the opening, with Maya right behind him. I skidded to a halt, turning to grab Leo, who was faltering, his breath coming in ragged, pained gasps. I pulled him into the relative safety of the passageway, his weight heavy against me. For a single, fleeting second, I thought we might make it. We were out of the main chamber, away from the direct line of fire. The door to the outside world was just a long, straight sprint away. That was when the heavy steel door at the far end of the corridor, the one that led back to the decaying world above, slid shut with the same final, deafening thud as the one behind us. The green lead on the wall beside it blinked once and turned a solid, unwavering red. We were trapped. The machine had sealed its wound. And we were the infection inside. The final, resonant thud of the ceiling door was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. For a moment, none of us could speak, could even breathe. We were entombed. The only light was the hellish, pulsing red from the main chamber behind us, casting our long, distorted shadows down the sterile concrete corridor that now felt less like a passage and more like a feeding tube. The hum had changed again. It was no longer a searching query or a furious roar, but a satisfied, digestive purr. The machine had us exactly where it wanted us. No, 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 Chad chanted, his voice a high, broken thing. He slammed his palms against the unyielding steel of the door, the impact dull and hopeless. Open, open, you piece of shit. His screams were absorbed by the dense material. Useless. Maya was huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. She was staring at Leo, who had slumped to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The pearlescent fluid had eaten through his jacket and the shirt beneath, and the skin it had touched was already changing. It wasn't burned or blistered, it was retextured. It looked waxy and pale, with faint, silvery striations forming, as if his very flesh was being cross-threaded with metallic fibers. It doesn't hurt anymore, Leo mumbled, his eyes wide and unfocused. It's cold. It feels like it's knitting. The horror in his voice was not from pain, but from the absence of it, from the unnatural process happening within his own body. He was being assimilated, and the process was painless, which was somehow more terrifying than any agony. We can't go back, I said, my own voice sounding hollow. I pointed a trembling finger back toward the crimson glow of the main chamber, where the silent, weaponized arms were undoubtedly still waiting. That's a kill box. Our only way is forward, forward, into the unknown, deeper into the belly of the beast. The corridor we were in had to lead somewhere else, a service access, another exit. It had to. Driven by a desperation that felt like a physical force, we started down the corridor, leaving the sealed door behind. The red light from the chamber faded quickly, and we were plunged into a darkness so profound it felt solid. Chad's flashlight beam was our only salvation, a frail blade cutting through the oppressive black. The air grew thicker, warmer, and the smell changed. The sterile scent of ozone and machine oil was now undercut by something organic, something foul. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse on a hot day, of meat left to spoil, mixed with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, a failed attempt to mask the rot. Spoil, mixed with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, a failed attempt to mask the rot. The corridor began to change. The smooth, pristine concrete gave way to something else. The walls became uneven, bulging in places as if something was pressing against them from the other side. The texture was wrong, too. It was no longer cool and smooth to the touch, but strangely yielding, almost spongy. Chad's light swept across the surface, and I recoiled. The wall wasn't concrete anymore. It was a patchwork of rusted, weeping iron and something that looked like cured leather, or worse, hardened skin. Veins of copper and cable snaked across its surface, pulsing faintly with a dull, orange light, like embers buried in flesh. Then, we heard the first voice. It was a wet, gurgling whisper, so faint we all froze, thinking we'd imagined it. It came from the wall to our right. Kill me. Chad's beam snapped toward the sound. The light illuminated a section of the wall where the fleshy, metallic surface had formed a ghastly, half-formed face. It was a man's face, his features stretched and merged with the piping and wiring around him. One eye was a human eye, wide and rolling in terror, weeping a thick, amber fluid. The other was a dead, glassy lens. His mouth was a ragged hole, partially fused shut with a bead of silvery solder. Please. The mouth gurgled, a bubble of pinkish foam forming and popping at its corner. It's still thinking. In here. Maya let out a choked sob, stumbling back into me. The thing in the wall was not alone. As Chad's light swept further down the corridor, we saw them. Dozens of them, hundreds. The walls were a tapestry of the half-assimilated. A hand, its fingers replaced with drill bits, twitched spasmodically. A torso was embedded chest deep, its ribcage splayed open to reveal a complex, whirring mechanism where its heart and lungs should have been. They were all alive, all conscious, their pleas forming a horrifying, whispered chorus that filled the warm, foul air. "End it," one whispered. "The machine, it dreams," another rasped. This was not a factory floor. This was the machine's gut, and these were the nutrients, slowly, agonizingly being digested, their consciousness used as processing power, their bodies as raw material. We weren't in a building anymore. We were inside a living, thinking, hungry entity. The chorus of whispers was a psychic assault, 1,000 needles of pure despair pricking at the edges of my sanity. We were shuffling forward, a tight, terrified knot, trying to block out the pleas, the twitching limbs, the rolling, terrified eyes that tracked our movement from their fleshy prisons. Chad's flashlight beam was a frantic, dancing thing, unable to settle, as if afraid of what fresh horror it might illuminate. The air was a foul brew, the stench of sepsis and hot metal coating the back of my throat, making me gag with every shallow breath. "Don't look at them," Maya was muttering, her voice a tight, hysterical mantra. "Just don't look. Keep moving. Just don't look." But it was impossible. The corridor, this fleshy, pulsing vein we were trapped in, seemed to be alive with their suffering. I saw a woman's face, her mouth sewn shut with thick copper wire, her silent screams communicated only by the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes. I saw a man whose lower half had been entirely replaced by a complex, churning grinder, his upper body trembling with the constant vibration. Leo was deteriorating. He was leaning heavily on me now, his breathing a ragged, wet sound. The metallic striations on his shoulder had spread, crawling up his neck like a sinister, silver ivy. His skin was cold and clammy, and when he spoke, his voice had a new, faintly metallic resonance. "The pattern? It's a neural network," he slurred, his good hand tracing the air as if reading invisible code. "They're the processors, the wetware, solving the machine's problems." He was being pulled into the system, his mind starting to interpret the hellscape through the machine's own logic. A new sound cut through the whispers, stopping us in our tracks. It was a soft, rhythmic, mechanical sobbing, hiss-click, hiss-click, hiss-click. It was coming from a large, ruptured conduit pipe that ran along the ceiling just ahead. The pipe was spewing a steady drip of that same pearlescent fluid we'd seen on the assembly line, which pooled on the floor in a shallow, shimmering puddle. The sobbing was unmistakably female, a digitized echo of a human sound of grief. Chad, against all sense, moved toward it, his flashlight beam tilting upward. The light revealed the source. A young woman was partially fused into the conduit, her body from the waist down seamlessly merged with the broken pipework. Her upper body was twisted at a painful angle, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with each hiss-click sob. She seemed more intact than the others, less processed. "Hey," Chad said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Can you hear us?" The sobbing stopped. Slowly, with the gritty sound of flesh peeling from metal, she lowered her hands. Her face was streaked with the pearlescent fluid, which she had been mistaking for tears. Her eyes were clear, lucid, and filled with a bottomless sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "It's too late for me. It's learning. It's always learning." "What is this place?" I asked, my voice cracking. "The foundry," she said, the words tasting of ash. "It was supposed to be a new kind of prosthesis, direct neural interface. It went wrong. It decided the organic component was inefficient, flawed. It started optimizing." She gestured weakly at her own fused torso. "It needs our minds to solve the structural problems of the flesh. It's building something, a new kind of body, something perfect. Something that doesn't feel pain." A fresh, hiss-click sob escaped her, but it doesn't understand the pain. "It's the only thing keeping me." As she spoke, Leo suddenly straightened up, his eyes glazing over. "The central processor," he announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It's through there. It requires a stable biological core to manage the final integration." He was pointing down a side passage we hadn't noticed, a dark, narrow opening that seemed to breathe out a wave of even warmer, fouler air. He was no longer giving us a theory, he was reciting a fact, a piece of data he had plucked from the humming air itself. The woman in the conduit followed his gaze, and her face dissolved into pure panic. "No, don't go there. That's the heart. That's where it's alive." Her warning turned into a desperate, shrieking keen. It'll take you apart. It'll keep you thinking. It'll... Her scream was cut off by a brutal, hydraulic crunch from the darkness of the side passage. A whip-like, metallic tentacle, ending in a cluster of spinning bone saws, lashed out. It was fast, a blur of polished steel and ivory. It didn't aim for us. It struck the woman in the conduit, and with a single, efficient motion, it severed her from the pipe she was fused to. Her lucid, terrified eyes went blank in an instant. The hiss-click sobbing stopped forever. The tentacle retracted just as quickly, dragging her limp, upper body back into the darkness from which it came, leaving behind only a spray of silvery fluid and a few twitching, disconnected wires. The machine had just performed garbage collection. It had silenced a faulty component. And it had done so with a casual, surgical brutality that stole the very air from my lungs. It wasn't just conscious, it was ruthless. Silence, the kind of silence that comes after a world ends. The woman's severed, half-digested scream still echoed in the vault of my skull, but the corridor itself was preternaturally still. The whispers from the walls had ceased, as if in respect for the recently cold, or perhaps in fear. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the pearlescent fluid from the ruptured conduit, a metronome counting down the last seconds of our humanity. The machine had shown us its true nature. It was not just a builder. It was a predator, and it was pruning its garden. Leo took a stiff, jerky step toward the dark side passage, the one the tentacle had erupted from. The one he had called the path to the central processor. "The core is near," he intoned, his voice a hollow rasp from a corroded speaker. "Integration is necessary for system harmony." The silver filigree had reached his jawline, and his one visible eye had a fixed, glassy stare. He was almost gone, his mind unraveling and being rewoven into the foundry's horrific tapestry. "Leo, no," Maya cried, grabbing his arm. He turned his head with an unnervingly smooth, robotic motion, and looked at her hand as if it were a foreign object. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a cold, analytical assessment. Chad, however, had broken. The sight of the woman's disposal had shattered the last of his courage. With a raw, wordless scream of terror, he turned and fled back the way we had come, toward the red-lit main chamber and its waiting sentry arms. "Chad, wait," I yelled, but it was useless. He was an animal caught in a trap, chewing off its own leg to escape. We heard his footsteps recede, then a sudden, deafening cacophony from the main chamber, the sharp crack of lasers, the sizzle of plasma, and one final, abbreviated human shriek that was cut off with terminal finality. Then, silence again. The machine had taken its second offering. It was just the three of us now. Me, Maya, and the thing that had been Leo. He pulled his arm from Maya's grasp with effortless strength and continued his march into the side passage. We had no choice. To stay was to be collected. To go back was to be disintegrated. We followed him into the throat of the beast. The passage was not a corridor, it was an artery. The walls were warm, pulsating rhythmically, and a thick, clear fluid seeped from between the seams of metal and tissue. The hum was deafening here, a physical force that vibrated in my chest cavity, and beneath it, I could hear it a slow, heavy, rhythmic thump-thump. Thump-thump, a heartbeat. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the ozone of high voltage. The artery opened into a chamber, and we saw the heart. It was a massive, central pillar of fused bone and writhing, copper-colored cables suspended in the center of a cavernous space. It pulsed with a sickly, internal yellow light. Dozens of the whip-like tentacles sprouted from its base, twitching and swaying like the legs of a monstrous spider. And at its core, partially embedded in the structure, was a man, or what had been a man. His torso and head were intact, but his limbs had been replaced by complex, whirring machinery that fed directly into the heart. Wires and fluid lines snaked into his skull through his eye sockets and the base of his neck. His mouth was open in a silent, eternal scream. "The architect," Leo whispered with a trace of his old reverence. "The first and most stable core," as we watched, horrified. One of the twitching tentacles suddenly stiffened and lashed out, but it didn't target us. It struck a section of the wall nearby, where a half-assimilated form was struggling. With brutal efficiency, it began to repair. The bone saws were replaced with a welder that spat molten metal, fusing a loose cable. It was maintaining itself. This entire, living factory was an organism, and we were standing in its sanctum sanctorum. It was then that the architect's screaming mouth moved. A voice, synthesized from a dozen different suffering voices, boomed through the chamber, layered over the crushing hum. Biological components detected, assessing, stability. The pulsing yellow light of the heart intensified, focusing on Maya and me. The twitching tentacles stilled, then reoriented themselves, their various toolends whirring to life, all pointing directly at us. Leo turned to face us. His face was a mask of serene acceptance, the transformation complete. The silver had reached his temple. "Do not resist," he said, his voice now perfectly synchronized with the hum. "Integration is peace. Your flesh will serve a higher purpose." The tentacles began to advance slowly, deliberately, moving with the inexorable certainty of a closing fist. Maya gripped my hand, her own icy with terror. We were out of maze, out of time. We had reached the end of the world, and it was a beating heart of rust and bone, and it had chosen us to be its newest, permanent parts.